questions about how some of this work might live into the future. And I rearranged this talk like 5 times before I kind of came up with something. And rather than speak in kind of general terms about what we as artists need to do about the future of our work and how it might live on or die a nice death with a funeral, which is the way I would like to see some of my work go. I think I'm just going to talk about some personal history and then how different each and every work that I do, and I think as probably we do as artists, is, and why there maybe is no real, how do I want to say, like a cheat sheet for solving these kinds of issues in the future and looking to the future. So as you heard, I come from San Francisco. I mean, I didn't really grow up there, but after I graduated university, which was an intermediate arts degree, so a time-based arts degree, I left for California. I'm from the States, so naturally I went west to follow the sort of historic kind of where the media was, and I landed a job first as a volunteer at this place called Artist Television Access, which has been and is still going on since about 1986, so it's just over 30 years old. It's an amazing place, but it's been carrying on exhibitions, production, and cable access channel, or at least a show on a cable access channel for all those years. And so, I mean, we had a pile of things there that kind of looked a little bit like this, and in fact, at the bottom is Craig Baldwin, who still is operating out of that space, and an experimental media maker and filmmaker, as well as host to the Other Cinema program, which has been there every Saturday night, come sort of hell or high water. And that's an actual photo from the basement, and I wish I had pictures. This is sort of pre-smartphone, so I don't really have a picture of the pile of tapes that we had. But thankfully, they just did a huge crowdsourcing campaign and raised enough money to digitize the sort of archive of ATA, which is great. And I mean, it's one small kind of artist-run center on the West Coast that managed to do that. And it's I have tapes there too. I don't even know what they are anymore. I was making a lot of work there. But at least some of it is being saved. Hopefully this kind of sets a precedent for other artist-run centers, and they're able to go along with that work. I mean, and the good news about this is I guess this is sort of the easy part in a way, because the work is sort of already produced and it sits on a tape and it's kind of linear in fashion, or it sits in one of these cans and you can, at the very least, hold it up to a light source and see what the images are. The sound gets a little trickier, I suppose, but it's kind of there in a much more stable format than these digital or magnetic analog tapes. The biggest problem with ATA, of course, was funding, even back then. So there was a very skeleton staff. There was myself and 2 other directors, and then a set of 30 volunteers. But our NEA funding sort of ran out, and I had to run off and get another job. And so I lucked out and I went from sort of the most kind of underground punk rock venue in San Francisco to sort of the big red building downtown, the SFMOMA, which, you know, truth be told, when I started there, I had an interview with a lot of different departments. One of them is the conservation department. They asked me what my views were on some digital media and how to save that or save some of the tapes. And I stuck my foot in my mouth and I said, well, you know, some artists feel like their work should be ephemeral and it should probably just, you know, fade away and it was like, I don't even know how I got the job after answering that question. And what it made me realize is that there is a belief institutionally, and I sort of I'm slowly coming around to this idea that, you know, when as a work is collected, that's kind of a snapshot. Now, my work itself doesn't necessarily fall into that because it's by its very nature, it doesn't there is no kind of snapshot that it can have, or at least anymore there isn't a snapshot that you can do. And while I was here, in fact, there was a big shift, I think, from new media and electronic media being kind of these tape-based formats or laser discs or multi-channel laser disc or 3/4 inch tapes to working with kind of directly with digital media. And we actually started to produce some works, namely one by Julia Scher, which I did the programming for, and another by the late Tibor Kalman, a designer who wanted a drumming floor kind of installed. So as you walked around and looked at his work, you could hear different drum beats and this kind of interactive sort of disco floor without the flashing lights. And that was a big shift. I mean, I was only there for a few years, but it went from linear media to sort of this non-linear kind of explosive interactive set of works that we had to start dealing with. And meanwhile, I'm sort of making my own work and starting to iterate through it as well. I mean, I'm just going to show a clip of this isn't really a clip, a still of an old work from 1998 that was produced at BAVAC, the Bay Area Video Arts Coalition, on their linear system. But the way that I did all of the sort of special, let's call them special effects, the sort of glitch effects, was just by monkeying around with the actual jog wheels as I was doing insert editing or whatever. And this work, I guess I wanted to show it because it's the first time that it's a signal to me that this was the first time that I was starting to iterate through different forms of media. So as a single channel work, it screened at a lot of film festivals, but then the next year I had an opportunity to produce an installation, and I decided to use the same sort of work and project it onto a cube, like this sort of a projection mapping work, but it was using CRT projectors and a set of 3/4 inch tape decks and keeping them in sync. So it was a huge process. I mean, it would be super easy now, and we could run it off of my laptop probably without much of a problem, except that it wouldn't have the same feel. So, I don't know how to ever, I don't know if this piece could ever be shown again unless I got some CRT works. And that's, I guess, this work kind of speaks to this idea of iteration, but yet where do you start to define what your work is or what our work is, and how to frame that in a way that then in the future, hopefully, because we all maybe are egocentric enough to hope that our work lives on, how does that get recorded, and in what way do we sort of store that information? Because the other part of doing this, of course, is that we all make decisions, or I shouldn't lump all of you in together with me, but I make a lot of my decisions based on, there's a few factors. There's the availability of technology, there's the funding, and then there's the architectural sort of space that you're tasked to work with. And those are all sort of constraints that we work within. But I recently, at a recent presentation, somebody said, well, imagine if it's the budget is no issue and you could do whatever you want. Well, I don't even know how to answer a question like that. It's sort of, where do you go from there? I think we all have to have these kinds of constraints, and how you map that out and keep notes of that will be a clear indication of the future. And I think in going back and looking at these, I realized that I didn't keep the best notes. And if I were to do this piece again, I would probably iterate it even further and do it with software. Because like I said, around this time, rather than working with these kinds of linear sort of pieces, the technology advanced in such a way that I became very interested in this idea of making nonlinear video. And this is just a few snippets of some of the first set of plugins for another piece of software called MaxMSP that allowed you to manipulate imagery and make moving images based on a set of rules rather than kind of editing linearly, like what is going to follow one thing to the next. And this suddenly opened up a lot of doors. I mean, it's not without its precedents, you know, with some things like the Sandine image processor, which we see here, which is still alive. This particular one is at University of Illinois at Chicago, and there's a number of these around. And strangely enough, these tools, or you know, thankfully enough, I should say, these tools have remained alive, and we're able to continue to make work on them, even as they're their own works in and of themselves. And there's a clear lineage between these kinds of like visual programming languages, such as this set of plugins. This is sort of its own project in and of itself, this NATO 55 3D modular by Machine Kunst. Whereas based on this kind of paradigm where you're patching physical cables together to make some imagery on a CRT screen. And all the while I'm sort of working on and with these kinds of tools and starting to understand them, and along comes this retrospective at SFMOMA in 2000 of Saul LeWitt. And the wonderful thing about working in a museum is that you get to have this relationship with the work that is on a long-term basis, and it's the thing that I miss the most is spending, you know, early mornings, quiet mornings in a museum or whatever, and being able to have this kind of relationship. And after looking at this, at Saul LeWitt, who I was kind of, I must say at the time, kind of ignorant to, and looking at this work, it became very clear that these pieces are software. You know, this is a programmatic way of creating the work. And just as a minor example, these kind of wall drawings, or this is one small example, that you know you have a loose set of rules that are expandable and iteratable, I suppose, if that's a word, and then you start to create, you know, over time, the work takes on all these kinds of different forms. It looks totally different, well, at least when you look at it enough, they are completely different, but yet they still sort of look the same. And that, to me, really was a signal that this is an early way of looking at software art. And for me, this is always what I go back to now in thinking about how to preserve, I guess, or talk about my work in a way that a collector or an institution can then kind of consider it and how it could sort of live on. And I have this like sort of great quote of his where, you know, and again, it's sort of understanding the system behind the work allows us to then understand why something happens kind of visually. And that, you know, in and of itself is a great way to describe kind of digital or software-based work. And I'll sort of go through a couple of pieces, I guess, specifically to just kind of talk about the different ways that that kind of question can be answered or open up a whole other set of questions. And like I said, this was a very eye-opening kind of process to go through with a few of these things, because I myself realized, wow, I haven't really answered all these questions for everyone and for these works to live on. So I have to go back and talk to some of these institutions and kind of make it very clear if I want to make sure that it's seen 500 years in the future, I think was one of the numbers that were thrown out earlier this morning. So first, this was a commission. This is 8-bit Metamatic it was a commission by the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh to do something specifically in this room that had, well, it didn't have to have the curtain, but when they first showed me the room, it had the curtain, and I said, oh yeah, if people are used to seeing it there and it's there, let's just work with what's there. I mean, it's sort of Mattress Factory's kind of mandate anyway, so we sort of left it there and projected it like this. But thinking about it in the future, if they were to move it to a different room or reinstall it somewhere, I started thinking like, okay, so how wrinkled does the screen have to be? I mean, this is a generative work that's created with software. In fact, maybe I'll just show a little clip of it. If I can find my cursor. So you can see a little bit of what it does. This is, of course, just a screen recording of some of the process that it kind of goes through. That's clearly is dropping frames as well. But at any rate, it was made as a sort of a drawing piece of software that would then be projected back onto this kind of wrinkled screen, kind of playing with the sort of super digital and kind of curvilinear shape of this screen. But I realize now, like, there's all sorts of questions like how wrinkled should the screen be? Does the screen, could it be installed on just a little curtain on the wall with other works if it was a bigger room? And all of these kinds of questions start to arise, and how to kind of quantify those. I'm not going to sit and answer them all here, but these are the sort of narrative issues or narrative descriptions that I think that we should start to talk about. There's ways to describe these works that are technical, and we can talk about we can quantify things like the ambient light in the room, the ambient sound in the room, the amount of contrast and brightness of the screen. But then I think that you have to begin to describe, not on a technical level, but how to describe this software and the way that it works in a sort of narrative fashion, rather than how the actual, rather than keeping the software, how do we keep the software that creates that alive, but how does the software do what it does in a sort of a paragraph or 2 paragraphs? That way, somebody like Mark, for instance, can recode it, and for me, it doesn't matter. It could be in, it could run from any kind of like Apache server, browser, window, blah, 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 as long as it sort of appears in this way, like it's C++ or C+++++, whatever is around in 500 years. I can't even imagine what it would be. Maybe we can just speak to it, and we can read the description of the software to the computer, and it will generate this thing. I mean, by then, let's hope so. We can all be artists. But the next work I want to talk about is guided Saccade. It was done for the Quebec Triennale twice in 2011. Here I see by my slides. Again, it's a generative piece running from a single computer. This one, as simple as it looks, there's like 3 pieces of software underneath it that make it run and do what it does. But again, it doesn't matter. And for me, this piece, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because it was collected by the Global Affairs Canada, they put Canadian work in embassies around the world and things like that. And they actually just contacted me last month because it's going to move from Jordan to Brussels, and they want to put it on a different platform and shrink it down to a single computer. And how do we go about doing this? Which, it's sort of the call that you want to get and the call that you don't want to get. It's kind of, going back and re-looking at this and seeing all the hacky ways that you've made something work, and because you're working on a tight deadline, and then having to sort of, I cleaned it up once to make it run in a way that I thought was pretty good. Things changed in these 5 years, and you realize, well, this could be done a lot simpler now with a couple of different tools. Ultimately, the tool set doesn't matter. It's how you get from, you have to start to identify where the art is. And that's one thing that I didn't really hear this morning, which I was kind of sad to hear, is like, we can talk about, is the art, what is it made by, how is it constructed, but what those interviews have to sort of create a kind of a fuzzy logic around, like, where is the art? Like, what is the thing that's important? You know, and for instance, with this work, the 3 channels don't necessarily really matter, but like how the squares are framed within the screen, the size of them in relation to the human body, these kinds of things are, and the timing of it, these are the things that are important to me. So again, in 500 years, when screens are God knows what ratio and what resolution, you know, there's a few very narrow, simple questions that we can answer about how this work should be in the, you know, Belgian embassy or wherever it is, or the Canadian embassy in Brussels. And those, you know, it's great because when you have a collector such as this sort of institution who is moving the work and who wants to show it, because it gives you a lot of opportunities to iterate through these processes and this is kind of what I was talking about in terms of if, then, when, and a loop for the future, because every time you redo this work, and I don't mean necessarily technically, but every time it gets installed, there's always a new set of relational kind of problems or issues that one has to solve. And that, again, paints this kind of fuzzy logic around the work that I think can slowly build an archive of acceptable kind of ways and means to install that. Installations are great to work with. I mean, they're sort of for me and my own practice, it's kind of the easy part. I also have an arm of work that's performance-based, and that's using these digital tools, these nonlinear tools, to kind of, what I imagine I'm doing is creating an instrument that can be played in a sort of a live setting. This is a recent work. Again, it's kind of real time, nothing is pre-recorded, and they kind of, each performance is sort of a new one, although they look the same. There's plenty of room, just like with any other instrument, there's plenty of room for improvisation. So how we as artists capture this, I'm not even sure that we should. And that's maybe a question for all of you. Like I kind of feel that this tool, here's a little bit of a screenshot of the base layer of the software. This one is in Touch Designer, and again, it's not even the interface that I play with. That's on an iPad. But how? I mean, do we even save this? I mean, there's some artists that I know that every time they finish with a performance, or when they feel that the performance has kind of run its due, they don't even save snippets of their code. They completely throw it away. I think Matthew Herbert in the early 2000s kind of wrote a manifesto about non-modularity of work. I couldn't ever do that. I'm sort of a bit too precious about some of the work that I do, and code kind of gets reused and put back through it. But again, like this, saving this doesn't do anything, and it's, of course, in proprietary software. I do all the wrong things that I always preach about when I talk about other people's work, but I use proprietary software. It's stuck in some particular operating system, and I'm sure like 50 years it will be impossible to look at this, let alone 500. It becomes a whole nother thing. However, maybe it's just the documentation of a performance. Maybe it's just maybe the important thing is to just know that it happened, or maybe the most important thing is that you had to be there kind of situation. In that same sort of line of work, I also do a lot of kind of tactical media that finds its form in a lot of different ways. This one happens to be another sort of larger scale performance. This was from Nuit Blanche. This particular performance was 2004, and we did a performance, a group of colleagues and I, from dusk till dawn, and capturing the electromagnetic spectrum as kind of a landscape, bringing it into a system, kind of remixing it, using it as media, as fodder for our own work to kind of paint a landscape of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then in this particular instance, we retransmitted that kind of real-time remix back to Riga, Latvia, for a festival that they were having. So it's these kinds of larger engagements with the spectrum and the landscape that I really get lost in and how to preserve. I mean, we have our technical writers. I mean, it takes a full day to set these projects up prior to the performance. It's a lot of different equipment, and it changes, of course, all the time and as time goes on. And in fact, these performances have become obsolete because the spectrum has changed. And it's become, of course, encrypted and digitized. And these were done at a time at the last days of sort of open analog transmissions where you could actually find open things on the spectrum to use as material. So again, these are kind of sort of destructing artworks. And again, it may just be the documentation that survives, but I'm not sure where to, these works, we spent an incredible amount of time on them and where they sort of live. But it's a much more, and I think we're going to hear a lot in the next days about dissemination within festivals versus galleries versus sort of online. So it will be interesting to sort of talk about those things and what the implications are, I think, for an artist who operates within these kinds of modes of dissemination. Finally, I guess I want to talk about one last installation, or we have I have a couple more, but we'll sort of speed through those. This last one is, and the reason I sort of bring it up is because, again, this recently got dredged up from the archives to be shown at, it's up in New York right now at sort of a new museum that's opening called The Current. And it was an interesting opportunity to re-engineer, or have to re-engineer, but still keep the piece looking the same. In 2008, I was working with a different set of projectors, a different set of software, and bringing it back. Let's see, I'll actually play a clip of this one as well. And what it does, and what I realized, it was very simple in when I talked to another artist who was in the show. I was describing what the piece did, and he said, "Oh yeah, it's very simple. It's just a bubble sorting algorithm," which in fact it is. And so this piece, it just draws, and this is what's in the documentation of the work. It draws one pixel at a time until all the pixels are full, and then where the projection lands on the rulers, those pixels are sorted based on the red, green, and blue values. And when the screen becomes full, it slowly erases and continues this bubble sorting algorithm. And that's basically it. And with a description like that and maybe some timing directions, this piece could be recreated in any number of pieces of software now. So it's, again, I think trying to keeping a GitHub or any kind of digital archive is good to a degree. I mean, it's written in proprietary software, so, in 10, 15, 20 years, it may be impossible to open that software. However, with a written narrative description detailing how the software works, it could be, again, in any kind of digital realm, as long as it's, for me, the important part is that it never repeats, and it runs in this sort of same way, which is very easy to describe. What the actual piece is, rather than talking about how the software works, or even inserting a million comments into the software. It completely defeats the purpose if, in fact, you can't open the software, or you have to go through these huge jumps or hoops to jump through just to get the, the floppy disk into and the data off of it into the computer, like we saw with the icons earlier this morning. So just another still. Finally, one last bit. This is another piece from the same sort of era, which has been collected a few times. And the collectors get a sort of, along with their kind of certificate of authenticity, it's this written description. This one is a written description because it's again, another sort of simple piece. And I tend to, I feel like if you can describe your work in these kinds of, like in a paragraph or two, it says something to the work itself. It is playing, okay? And so here what we have is just the basic tenets of how color is created on a computer. So you have 3 numbers, each representing the red, green, and blue. And as they count from 0 to 255 or 254, and as they count up, now I'm having a hard time describing it, but as they count up, the value is equal to their own value, and added together, it creates the background color. So it's a very simple sort of clock-based kind of system. Oh, and recently I did do this one, not in 2009, in 2016, just this year in Slovenia, and for the first time sort of did it as a projection. It had always been contained on a screen, but we had this sort of larger space, and it was, again, like the sort of, Santa Claus saying, okay, well, if you can do whatever you want, like, let's do it another way. So there are these ways, I think, these longer loops, it's, again, painting this kind of picture of what's acceptable for the work. And here we can see, like, while the projection is really big, the numbers aren't. So it's recorded in the notes of the work of how big it should be in relation to the human body, rather than making a giant sort of billboard out of it. However, if it was on a billboard, I guess the numbers would be bigger. And this has led me into actually making work that is never the same, even though it's the same piece. And this is the most recent piece that I just finished. That's sort of a larger interactive installation called Perspection, which uses some 3D tracking to basically do an anamorphosis of a projected image on a set of screens that places the viewer in the anamorphic, or creates the anamorphic projection from wherever the viewer is inside the room. And so based on, in the different places we've done it, because I'm working with a collaborator who does the sound, we've done it in Sao Paulo, we've done it in Germany, in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and a couple of other places. And each time it's sort of a different iteration of the screen based on the architecture, the flow of people around the room. But there are those few things that sort of never change, this tracking and anamorphosis and so on and so forth. So I've, gone from things that are kind of easy to describe to these things that I'm not sure how this piece could be, it hasn't been collected in some way, in any way. So for now, I'm the only one responsible for figuring out how this goes in a different number of spaces. But frankly, this one would leave me really confused as to how to archive that. Continuing along with my practice, as we heard earlier, I do have another chunk of work that I do across the circumpolar region. That we've done projects in Alaska, Nunavut, Lapland, and Russia. And these are working with indigenous communities to sort of integrate new technologies with traditional knowledge. The work itself, it happens in the north. For me, the art is the things that we do in the north, but it's created an enormous archive that mostly lives online and on a couple of servers. And we've created a number of different systems throughout the years, kind of hydroponic systems, sensor networks, power systems for use on the land, different kinds of architectures, mobile architectures, and some data processing and display kind of units, basically like a field controllable computers that are field usable computers that link up with satellites, and you can get different data from them or feed your own data into it for use in the north, sort of ruggedized. Pardon me. And again, so not only does it create an archive, but in the South, we do these sort of exhibitions of the prototypes and the ideas and sort of influences within these, and it's starting to grow into this, but the artifacts aren't the most important part of the work. And so I'm wondering how to, and this are, again, more questions, is like how do you archive, how do you conserve a work that, mostly happens here? Because if we go back to what Saul LeWitt said, in terms of understanding a system, and if the system is the basis of the artwork, then, what do you save? Because in this sort of work, the system is a set of exchanges between two different communities, me being from the South and the colleagues that I've met in the North. Like that's where the art is this exchange between two people. So where does that, where do you archive that? Where does that get saved? I mean, there's all the other artifacts that orbit around this sort of work, and this has been going for almost 10 years now. And again, it's the site of exchange being the salient part of the work. And I guess in closing, I just want to ask those questions. I want to bring those things to the forefront that I talked about, and it's creating, for me, what I've found as the most useful through my experiences both in institutions, in artist-run centers, and as an artist myself, is that you really need to have this tight sort of picture of what you feel the art is. And it's not necessarily about how to run the software and what buttons to click, because at the end of the day, that's not really going to matter. It's how you create a certain display, how you create a certain interaction, and to be able to describe that in a narrative way that somebody can recreate it, even if they don't necessarily have that work. And I think some of my inspiration for that, it comes from that early slide of Craig Baldwin sitting behind his film and knowing that those pieces of media, those pieces of art, you can still, like a human can still read them. And I think it was, as long as we stick with this kind of documentation as for me, the most important part of making the work, then I think we can move forward on all the technical descriptions and quantification and saving the original optical disc that the artist signed. I mean, those are all really fun art and interesting artifacts that can, talk about an artist's life. But if what we're talking about really is saving the work, then I think that's the description that we need. And I also want to say that it's been great to see this new sort of interest by artists working with software and technical, in their sort of techno sphere, that they are starting to come around to this idea of like, well, how does my work live on? And I think maybe it's because, we've all had our own work kind of disappear or be really hard for us to access. So it's, intrinsic to the speed at which technology changes. I mean, we could have made video art for quite a long time, and people were happy for quite a long time with just like, okay, we can go from our 1 inch to our 3/4 to digibeta or beta or whatever the progression was or is. It doesn't even matter hardly anymore unless you're kind of doing these deep academic kind of studies. But it's that, it's folks like Casey Rias and Raphael that are kind of, they've made these fantastic manifestos. And to see artists kind of start to come around to thinking about this as they're making the work, I think is only going to make everything a bit easier in the future. And of course, we have to include all the sort of players within the kind of economy of, or maybe economy is not the right word, the sort of cosmology of how the art world operates, whether it's institutions or collectors or the academy and the artists, and how those loose ends get tied together collectively, that we can all start to hopefully see this work live on in the future. So, thank you.
Okay, is there any question for Matthew? Okay, I will jump in. Like the first part of your presentation, you're really like starting with the Langlois quotation, and regarding your question of what the work is. And when you present your work, which are programmatic in a way, a lot of your work is also about perception. And it's inherent in the work, like perception, and perception is yet historical. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that? Because it comes to where the work ends. Because what I perceive in 1950 and what I perceive now is not the same, and like the bodily experience is historically rooted.
That's true. It is. I think, well, yes and no. I mean, I think the sort of, if we're talking about some of the works that are based around color, I think color has been a sort of a sensual, bodily experience, and even if we're talking outside the world of art. Now, of course, perception can be culturally codified or however you say that word. I can never get it right. And that's, I can only make these works from my own background. I mean, I know that, I think it's, now I'm gonna forget, but I think it's Russian has two different words for the color blue. I could be mistaken here, and I think green in Japanese is also kind of a gray area to mix my metaphors, I suppose. But how you record something like that, I suppose.
I know. So I guess at one point, I guess at one point the presentation of your work is open-ended to that, to that phenomenon.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. It's that's kind of, I think, I mean, to speak specifically, I guess, about maybe a particular work like the RGB work, I think that it's about this kind of idea of not having a name for every color that you see, and finally being able to kind of quantify, colors. It's been the, bane of civilization or Western civilization for a long time, of like, when does yellow turn to green? Or, there was a quote by Albers who said, I can ask everybody in a room to imagine the color red, and I can be sure that they're going to imagine the color red, but I can also be sure they're going to imagine a different red. with RGB, you know, if it's whatever the numbers would be, you know, if it's 255 or 254 and 00, then it's always going to be that in a particular color system that's you know, that we're using. That's the most common today, anyway.
Okay.
Hi. I was fascinated by what you were saying about defining where the art is or what it is that you're trying to archive or to save. And with that in mind, and I think I understand this correctly, your view is that the art part of it all is very much the experience of the art, whether it's the aesthetic experience, the conceptual experience, or the interactive experience, whatever it might be, that's the part that you felt is where the art begins. Which makes perfect sense to me, but I'm aware that there are artists out there who perhaps put more focus on the process or possibly the system, in which case they might view that as being more the core of where the art starts. Do you feel that your view on the experience of an artwork as the valid part to save for future generations is true across the board, or is that specific to your own work?
Well, I should clarify that, because I think what I'm trying to say is that there's to create the set of conditions that makes the art is sort of, for me, not so is the most important part, to be able to create those conditions for the experience to happen. And how it gets there, like, I don't care if it's a Macintosh or a PC or Linux or Raspberry Pi or whatever, like that to me, that's just, it's like a hammer. It just kind of gets you there. Like, it's not the house, let's say. You can just build one with it. So for me, it's about describing those set of conditions to create the work. Like, I wouldn't imagine that the RGB piece could ever be anything but a color shifting background with these numbers on it. That's got to be what it is, and that sets up a set of conditions to experience the art. Now, what people experience, I mean, I can never rightly tell. I mean, you know, how they perceive it. I mean, people are colorblind and all sorts of, you know, we all see it differently, and that's kind of the point of some of these experiential works as well, is that we can only. We all experience the world slightly differently, and that's an interesting point to me. I mean, even if we're standing next to each other, looking at the same thing or hearing the same thing, we don't experience it the same way. It's impossible.
Thank you. And to clarify something else, which I think I got, but something I found fascinating was that you've already pointed out, I'm not technical. I'm very much from the art world and not from the world of technosphere. But you've already pointed out that the rate of change and the evolution within the technical sphere is happening so fast that it essentially makes redundant any attempts to preserve itself, because it outmodes itself that quickly. You're talking about needing an unchanging anchor, something that we can use to describe and to pin all this down. And it sounds like right now the only possible one we could use is going right back to analog, I mean, pen and paper, essentially. And that's, I mean, that is correct. That is, I have that correct. That's what you see as
I
being.
think so. Yeah, I think because software, computers, this is all, it's obsolete. It's obsolete as soon as you start using it, almost. So, if you can describe it in a way that somebody can understand it, then you can find somebody to write the code to make it do what you want it to do. And whether that's just a narrative paragraph or a narrative paragraph and a flowchart with some timing situations written into a short list, then I think that's the best way to preserve this kind of work, because a piece of paper and ink is already going to last longer than what I have here on my computer.
Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could describe a little bit more one of the pieces that you mentioned, which was the live event. You described it as tactical media. I think it was Spectre, Scatter, ...
Yeah.
Because as tactical media, it's interesting because it really is a kind of live, immediate event, and as well, the elements that you were describing are really about feeding or sourcing live data that then gets transformed, and then it was a live stream that went elsewhere, which seems that the work itself would really be in the event and in the moment. I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, those are some of my favorite pieces, actually, and we, with those colleagues, we're continuing along that line. I mean, now it's kind of more about digital transmission and sort of the encryption of the kind of electromagnetic spectrum. But that particular work, I mean, I always have this dream of, when they perfect space travel and we can go faster than light speed, we could catch up with that transmission wherever it is out in the universe or the next universe, because it's still sort of existing out there, and it's wonderful to imagine that a transmitted kind of chunk of data is still out there traveling, unless it sort of bumps into something, or a black hole pulls it in. Although now they're saying maybe we can get some information out of black holes. But anyways, it is, these kinds of events that try to capture a particular time and a particular set of rules, I guess, that we're forced to live within, and we try to challenge those in a variety of different ways. I think, this is... for me, some of my favorite work, but it's also the most ephemeral in a way, because it is of a particular time. It couldn't, even if we did it 10 years from now again, I don't think it would even make sense to anybody of the people, to a lot of the people that were there, unless they were, of my own generation and could remember those days, because it's even the idea of like pulling these transmissions out of the air are sort of, that's already falling by the wayside. I mean, we think of the spectrum more as a place of surveillance and security than where TV comes from anymore. I mean, that used to be, I mean, that's what I grew up with anyway. So to be able to take control of that and then send out your own signal, it was a really empowering kind of act. And that piece was also, or that set of performances was sort of somehow doing that at the last possible moment. We all knew that television and these open analog kind of transmissions were slowly going by the wayside, and anymore it's only radio amateurs that are broadcasting in unencrypted analog sort of formats anymore these days.